Can we begin? I'd like to introduce my friend, our friend, Michael Mendizza. And I'd like to open this short introduction with a bold statement. Still can't hear me. All right. I'd like to begin with a bold statement, but terms used somewhat loosely. Saint Paul was to Jesus Christ what Michael Mendizza is to Krishnamurti. While Saint Paul never knew Christ, Michael knew Krishnamurti intimately and continues to be an apostle of the teachings well beyond Krishnamurti's passing 30 years ago. I use the word apostle in its original meaning as someone who has, without bias, supports a teaching and the messenger. Michael Mendizza has been one of Krishnamurti's most demanding and critical chroniclers, and has held the teachings up to spiritual and intellectual scrutiny without mercy. His credentials as an author, filmmaker, documentarian, and educator qualify him superbly to be both a student of the teachings as well as a very vocal public dialoguer through his media projects and his own writings, engaging in Krishnamurti's admonitions, take life seriously and be an outsider. Michael Mendizza's life work has been impressively successful in whatever he has touched. He is able to perceive and capture beauty, dignity, and the truth of a moment in all aspects of his work, whether it's while listening to and questioning Krishnamurti, writing a critical essay, or photographing wilderness and flowers. And there are two examples in this room. As a professional, Michael has produced some of the most lasting and significant recordings of Krishnamurti's life and teaching that is outside the audio, video, and text of the original teachings as delivered by Krishnamurti. His works are invaluable in the ongoing work of all four foundations of keeping Krishnamurti's teachings available worldwide in perpetuity. His films include The Challenge of Change and With a Silent Mind. Also the 12-part series Beyond Myth and Tradition. His books include...
Nope.
Pardon?
No, that was this. That one.
His books include Flowering, and a new book which is not quite out yet, a revolutionary look at Krishnamurti through dialogues with Samdang Rinpoche, called Always Awakening, Buddha's Realization, Krishnamurti's Insight. And the exhibition, The Mind of Krishnamurti, and the archive project called The First Generation, which is a series of 100 interviews with Krishnamurti's friends and associates. His educational work is also extensive. He's the founder of Touch the Future, a nonprofit learning design center supporting early childhood and family development. And he's the co-author of two books, Magical Parent, Magical Child, and The Art of Joyful Parenting, in collaboration with Joseph Chilton Pierce. Michael's talk this morning is provocatively titled Original Sin, Illusion, Collusion, and the Impossible Search for Truth. Michael.
I thought that was a good title. Forgive me, I will refer to some notes. I wrote an essay, which was what we're going to be talking about, and they're actually duplicating that essay for you so that you will be able to take it home, and it will be much more lucid and coherent and fleshed out than what we're going to play with this morning. Original Sin, Illusion, Collusion, and the Impossible Search for Truth. I have to say that essay began by really just looking at the phrase that Krishnamurti, that you all know and have heard a million times, truth is a pathless land. Now we've heard that, we've read it, we know what a profound and important statement that was, and position, I should say, that Krishnamurti took many, many, many years ago. And when I looked at it, I said, well, what are the two main words there? Truth is a pathless land, okay, and then pathless. So truth and pathless are the two key words in that. And did you ever ask, what do they mean by truth? Well, obviously, truth can't be defined. You can't define it. In conversation with David Bohm, I asked him, what is intelligence? And he says, well, essentially it can't be defined. Well, truth and intelligence are common or similar, you can't define it. Therefore, the easy part of the title is, it's impossible. You're never going to, quote, find truth or get it or hold on to it or define it and so on and so on. So any search for truth is obviously impossible. And yet so much of what we call our spiritual endeavors and our personal, growth and potential and all that has this kind of goal of reaching truth or understanding truth and so on and so forth. But that's never going to happen. So then you look at the other word, which is pathless, and really what he's saying is the opposite of that most of us are kind of locked into paths of one kind or another. And so he's basically saying truth is undefinable, and there's no system or path or whatever you want to call it that's going to get you there. Now, when he made that proclamation was in 1929, when he was basically cutting all ties formally with the Theosophical Society that was kind of, as you know, the ground upon which he kind of sprouted out of. And there was a very strong backlash to that proclamation. And the key figure at that time was not C.W. Leadbeater or Annie Besant, because they were old, they were more elderly at that time. The real pushback came from the then leader of the association, and George Arundel. Now, George rejected flat out the truth is a pathless land. And he doubled down, actually, by creating something called the Egyptian Rite. And the Egyptian Rite in the Theosophical construct was a very secret, very private, very, esoteric. I mean, he just raised the whole bar and came out with something that basically doubled down on Krishnamurti saying, truth is a pathless land and we don't need systems and all this stuff. So the essay that we're going to explore looks at that dynamic. Kay's proclamation, his insight, and then the pushback that came, I'm going to say politically, from George Arundel and how he responded to what Krishnamurti's statement was. And as I began to look at that, I said, this is like playing chess. This is kind of a spiritual chess game, if you want to put it in those kind of terms. So that the game, I phrased it, the games that the ego plays. The games that the ego plays. Now, I'm going to circle back a little bit. Mark mentioned that Samdong Rinpoche and I spent a lot of time together, and I'm honored about that. One of the statements that he made, he said, well, Michael, it's very simple. There's only two states, unenlightened and enlightened. It's very simple. And I said, okay, well then, so in our conversations and dialogues, we explored, well, what's the difference between enlightenment and the unenlightened and so on. And I've also done a series for many years. I was curious. I said, we're not who we think we are. So that prompts the question, well then, who and what are we really? If we're not what we think we are, then what and who are we really? And frankly, that loops back and actually becomes the kernel or the heart of the whole Buddhist tradition. That's the fundamental, I didn't know that, but that was the core about the whole deal. And also, this thing called ego comes into play. what is the ego? Now, all of you have seen or experienced your ego kind of, doing what it does, but nobody's seen their ego. Nobody's found it in the closet, right? You can't find it. No matter how hard you look, you're not going to be able to find it. And in talking with various people about this, it boils back to language. It comes back to the capacity of what's called the neo-mammalian or neocortex, our capacity to imagine. So language, the capacity to imagine and language are inseparable. They're all part of this core capacity. And out of that comes two things. The main thing that comes out of it is story. The neocortex can tell stories. The sensory motor brain doesn't tell stories. It just says hot, cold, touch, and senses, and so on. You have in using the triune brain formula or model, you have a mammalian brain, which is called the limbic brain. And that limbic brain gives you information about what's going on inside you. How are you doing inside as you relate to outside? So the sensory motor brain gives you information from the outside, and then the mammalian brain gives you information about what's going on inside, and then the neocortex is kind of planted in those two, and that brain takes that information and makes abstractions out of it. It tells stories about the information that the other two brains are giving you. And the interesting thing about these three brains, and there's more, the prefrontals come into play. The heart is actually a brain. There's a brain in your heart, or the brain is filled with neurons, just like the brain is. So you have various brains in you, and each of those brains create different kinds of images or orders of images. Your senses are actually resonant representations of the various external vibrations that you're going to get, and the limbic brain is giving you information about what's going on inside, and that information is translated into what's called resonant representations or images. And the neocortex gives you the images that you're used to when you think. When you think, you're actually creating images inside. So this notion of the brains creating images and each of the brains creating different images is fundamental to understanding truth is a pathless land. So image making, as you very well know, image making is a huge component of Kay's teachings. And there's something that happens that's different with the neocortex images that are different fundamentally from the other more, shall we say, primal brains. Sensory motor brain is in the present moment. The limbic brain is in the present moment. The neocortex is not in the present moment. It has time, right? It's only the neocortex has time. The other brains don't have time. And it has language and symbols, symbolic capacities, and so the neocortex is able to create all of these very abstract images that are not limited to time and space. They could be anywhere, about anything. Not so with the other brain systems. So you have the evolution of this magical, wonderful capacity, but in it are these qualities that kind of outpace your ability to keep track of them. So I have a quote from David Bohm that I would love if somebody would read it. Where is David? Who would like to read this for me? So right here, it's this short paragraph, right?
Paragraph.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll stand. We don't really understand the nature of our thought process. We're not aware of how it works. how it is disrupting not only our society and our individual lives, but also the way the brain and nervous system operate, making us unhealthy, perhaps even damaging the system. Krishnamurti recognizes that thought, rational, orderly, factual thought, such as in doing proper science, is valuable, but the kind of thought that he has in mind is self-centered thought. The ultimate purpose of Kay's work was stated very early in his life, in his work, which was to free humanity from the destructive conditioning around this self-centered thought, which is really enslavement to absurdity, to destruction, to unhappiness, sorrow, and no other kind of freedom means anything unless we are free from that. Therefore, I think he felt that once man was free from that, then the way would be open to creative unfoldment in all sorts of directions. David Bohm with Michael Mendizza.
Thank you. So, Krishnamurti didn't, he said, be aware of your senses, be aware of what's going on in you, be sensitive. The art of listening and observing was something that was very central to what he was talking about. And he challenged rather relentlessly imagination. And he's really talking about this neocortex. He's talking about this wonderful capacity for language, symbol, metaphor, and so on and so forth. So out of this capacity that the neocortex represents, and we've had it for 50,000 years or so, roughly, two things kind of come out of that. And I like to use the metaphor of looking through a telescope. If you look at the telescope from one side, then everything, gets closer. And if you look at it from the other side, everything gets far away. Well, it's the same telescope. It's just a changing view, the shift of view. So if you look at what the neocortex does, which is make up stories about stuff, the two main stories that it makes up is it fragments with one perspective, and it says, you have an ego. You are an independent entity. There is a thinker. In Kay's vernacular, you have the thinker and the thought. There's a separation. Here is the thinker, and the thinker does the thinking. Well, Krishnamurti says, no, that's crazy. It's one process that's fragmenting and then being imagined. You're imagining these two fragments and so on and so forth. So it's a function of imagination that both creates the story that we call me, our ego, our social image, and culture. This was such a huge bite of realization for me, was that what we call culture and what we call self are the same thing. They emerge from the same process. They're just different ways of looking at the same thing. One is personified as a personal image, and the other is externalized as an outer image. There's a wonderful and very smart man. His name is Gabor Mate. He's written a bunch of, 4 or 5 books. And he talked about self-image, this construct, how do we become who we think we are, is by navigating the threats that are implicit in the outer culture. And we form our personal identity, our self-image, by trying to navigate the do's and don'ts and shoulds and shouldn'ts and the praise and punishments that we are subject to as we grow. And so it's really a coping mechanism. And this was the term that Gabor used. Our self-image is actually a coping mechanism that's used to navigate the slings and arrows and pleasures and pains of the outer culture. So our self-image is actually a coping mechanism. That's really brilliant. And I think it's totally accurate. So it's, we are much more than a coping mechanism and so on and so forth. So we play this thing. But then this other aspect of the neocortex that is so miraculous is that we believe our stories. The capacity to generate the story and to create these images is so powerful that it overtakes us, and we are completely lost in the enchantment that this image-making capacity from the neocortex is capable of generating. So we get lost in the enchantment. And then comes in something that's even more significant, and it's called reify, or reification. And again, I have to thank David Bohm, because he was the guy who pointed all this out. To reify is to take an abstraction and treat it as though it's real or concrete. That's reification. Reify, to reify. So we fabricate these stories about culture and self-image, which is a fragmentation of this one capacity, and then we reify it and we treat it as though it's real. And we don't know that we're doing that. Now, the Sanskrit calls it Maya. Maya being an illusion that looks like the truth. It may not actually look like the truth. It's that we reify it as the truth. We are doing this, right? We're doing this. Now, what I'm going to propose to you is that reification of the capacity that we've been talking about is original sin. And actually, when you look back at the biblical thing, and I'm not a Bible person at all, but there's a few phrases that kind of get handed down and you can kind of remember them. And one of them is Moses bringing down, here's Moses up on high. Again, was he really on the top of a big mountain, or was high metaphoric for higher consciousness, an altered state, a better view, more intelligent? I'm going to assume the latter. So here he was, and he discovered, whatever he discovered, and then he walked down, and all the guys and the ladies were down there worshiping the golden calf on the altar, and they were still stuck in reifying their story, which was the image, so on and so forth. Does that make sense? You're following this, right? So even if you look at Moses, you can see that reification was actually was at place. He's saying, don't do that. Place no images before truth, not instead of God. It got translated, but instead of truth as it actually is. But reification kicks in, and we create all these images and so on and so forth. So we have all these illusions, and we worship them, and we treat the golden thing as though. But we do that to ourselves, and we also become national. And all of these things that Kay was talking about really hinge on this miraculous capacity to imagine, and the reification that steps in, treating it as though it's a real thing. So then again, reading one of David's books, this again Bohm. David looked at this more carefully than anybody that I've ever come across. And in his book, Science, Order, and Creativity, I happen to be interested in play. The book that I wrote with Joe Pierce actually is about play. And so I was keenly interested in play. And as I'm reading David's book, he talks about play. But in his context, he's talking about the very nature of what he calls consciousness, but he was really referring to imagination, because he's looking at the capacity for science, and that's really to wonder and to investigate and explore, and it's really moving into this imaginative field with great rigor and order. Not being sloppy and messy and not knowing where you're at and doing what we do habitually 24/7, but actually bring some order to it. And he pointed out that the whole nature of that imaginative structure is play. It's to create images that one could then ponder and explore and question and so on. Not to reify, right? Not to take this as though it were something. It's a play. And he pointed out that to play falsely with that capacity, to treat that capacity falsely, was the big error. So, and then, yes?
Well, it's bringing to mind there's some kind of a myth about someone that was told not to look back, and they looked back, and they returned to salt. It sounds like that's what you're saying, that they, in a sense, were reified, they were solidified, they looked back.
Well, I don't, maybe I'd have to, yes, could be, I don't know. I vaguely remember the turning the salt thing, but what I'm trying to say is that what this original sin is something that's built into our whole structure and we are not aware of it. And we keep sinning by playing falsely with this capacity over and over and over again. Once it sets in and we reify the self and we reify culture as though they are concrete realities instead of something to play with, and then we identify with that, that's who we are, we're screwed. And you can't get out of it easily.
I think Matthew Fox, he talks about this process, and he puts an interesting spin on it. Same thing with Bohm, how they connect the process with, in order for thinking to develop, this process in our human brains and our evolution needed to happen, and then the original blessing becomes the understanding of it, and getting fully acquainted with that movement becomes a blessing, because then it's open for something more. It kind of opens it up. And I thought that when Kay talks about giving supreme importance to thinking, he's referencing that in all of our pursuits as human beings, where thinking becomes the master, we are unable to see that it's not taking us in the direction we need to go. It's actually leading us into deeper darkness.
Yeah, so let's cycle back, turn back a little bit, and remember there's only two states. One state is enlightened, and the other is not. Right? So the unenlightened state is one that's kind of muddled up and not very clear about what its own structure and what its capacities and what it's doing, as Bohm talked about. And then he went further, and he said, and this was kind of this play on collusion. The word play in Latin is ludere. I'm probably massacring it, but something like that. And I have it written down for you, so you can take it with you. And the other root of that is illusion, and then collusion and delusion. All of them come from the same root, which is to play, but it's to play falsely. Right? So obviously, this is not a new idea. This has been around for centuries and centuries and a long time. People have been aware of this original sin idea and how it's rooted in playing falsely with consciousness itself and then getting lost in it, and reification being this original sin that reincarnates every time you think, because you've got this fly in the soup. And you know, when Bohm and Krishnamurti met for the series of dialogues called The Ending of Time, you know, they began with the question, humanity must have made a wrong turn someplace. That's where those dialogues began. I wonder what that is. I'm proposing that the false turn was what we're talking about. That's the original sin that I'm rephrasing. Now, let's see if we can swing this around and talk about Krishnamurti in 1929 and George Arundel and the Theosophical Construct and what Krishnamurti saw and what I call the pushback or the game that was being played. One of the hallmarks or attributes of what I'm going to say is we can pick either one. Let's pick the unenlightened brain, the unenlightened state. As we just described, it has comparison and egos. It has self-images. It has your image opposed to your image, opposed to culture and this and all of this stuff going on. And it's pretty blind to what it is actually doing. That's the unenlightened brain. Now, let's have an insight into this process, and you see it. You see it so clearly. You see what is normally going on. Well, I'm again very loosely going to suggest that that the enlightened state is not in time. It doesn't have those images. It doesn't have images of self and culture. It's not reifying. And from that perspective, it's looking back on what humanity is doing habitually all the time. And you just see it so clearly. I'm going to suggest that this was Krishnamurti's insight/observation. He just saw that the whole thing was a mess. And there was no way to fix it. You can't fix the mess. You just have to stop making messes. Right? It's pretty simple. You can't fix it. You just have to stop, which is negation in the Buddhist tradition. You just negate making messes, and you negate that mess, and you negate that mess, and pretty soon you've negated most of the stuff, and then you can see fairly clearly. Yes?
You have to have a common idea of what a mess is, or to coexist on this planet with people, because some people may think their stuff is not a mess, and other people who may be subjected to it may think it is a mess. So is there some type of commonality that we need in our thinking or belief process of what a mess is?
It's a really great question. I'm going to say that and I'm going to answer the question obliquely because I can't really answer it directly, but what comes to mind is back in conversation with Rinpoche Samdong, he said, that ego is much trickier than we think it is. And it acts in and does all kinds of things. And again, I'm going to go back to this. It's a flaw in the whole structure of things. The whole thing is skewed. The whole thing is skewed. What they call samsara, which is our reality. This is our reality, folks. What I'm talking about when I say the ego and language and symbol and metaphor and all of that, this is your reality. It's how you perceive things to be. Now, the rare but common state of enlightenment is literally a different reality. And from that clarity, the mess becomes apparent. But you can't fix the mess from within the mess. You can't self-correct it. You can't fix it. The mess can't self-correct itself no matter what new method or system or thing because of original sin, which is this deeply rooted flaw in how we perceive reality. So, Krishnamurti, 29, said, truth is a pathless land. In that statement, truth cannot be defined. There is no ego in truth or in that enlightened state. There's no ego. There's no time, there is, etc., etc. Now, for George, let me back up a little bit because let's bring back my game metaphor. That'll help to show you. In samsara, in the reality that we think is real and what our normal operating behavior is implicit the ego. The ego is all through that. Remember the telescope metaphor? It's not that the ego is separate, or we idealize that, or we reify that entity as being, in the closet or whatever, but it's not. It's in the whole system. It's nonlinear in that way. The ego is nonlinear. It can morph into anything because it's the whole structure. is the ego. Does that make sense? This to me is pretty important because, you know, as long as you're a fragment looking for the fragment and you don't realize that the whole structure is the ego.
That would go into conscious, unconscious, all of it's ego.
All ego is permeated. It's nonlinear. That's a good way of saying it. The ego is nonlinear. Professor.
If there is no way for the man who is caught in the mess to get out of it, in short, you're saying it's impossible, then how did someone like Krishnamurti or Ramana or Buddha get out of it? Were they never in the mess? Does that mean they didn't have the neocortex?
Which?
That they did not have the neocortex
No, of course they do.
capacity to make a mess? Obviously, everybody is in a mess because everybody grows up in a culture. But it is possible for a human being, even though he is trapped in the mess, to have an insight. And there have been instances of this. Maybe not total enlightenment, but people who had a deep insight, even though they were previous to that, caught in a mess. So I question your statement that the one who is in the mess cannot get out of that mess.
Well, I'll try to qualify it, and I'm happy to meet at lunch and we can arm wrestle about it. I'm saying that you can't use the state of mind that is mess, to get out of the mess. This is the role of negation in the whole Buddhist tradition, is that you negate and you negate and you negate and you negate until you stop making messes, and then you see differently, and that's where the insight comes. But you're not going to come up with a new idea that's implicitly infected with messiness, and you're going to spawn a new something that's just going to get you out of the mess. You're just simply going. The mess is there. It permeates the whole thing. So Kay looked back and he saw that the whole thing was a mess. Truth is a pathless land. You can't get there. That statement negated not only George Arundale's personal ego, which is what plays the game, right? But it also negated the whole structure and belief system that ego was identified with. So Kay's statement was literally suicidal to George. Now, I'm not picking on him. I'm just saying that we have to back up from that statement and look at the coming world teacher as a game that the ego plays. And when you look at the whole thing about the coming world teacher from a game standpoint, what are the rules? Well, you have ascended masters. Only the chosen ones can connect to and be inspired by these ascended masters. Now, those ascended masters are a hierarchy. There's the various levels of soldiers or enlightenment, or now you have a general and you have the this and the Mahachohan and the blah, blah, blah. You have this whole hierarchy. And only the chosen ones get to play the game, and then you get paired up with one of the masters that are in this hierarchy. And then you identify with that and reify it. That's the game. And your personal identity is now interwoven and dependent on how well you play the game. Well, George used to sit on H.P. Blavatsky's knee as a child. He was Krishnamurti's first educated. He was the guy, one of the main people sustained. There were others that were tutors, but George was Krishnamurti's main tutor. Annie and CWL were slipping in the mists were rising and George was coming in. He had the whole society. And in 24 and 25, he got pretty charged up about the reification and connection with the masters and bringing stuff through. And there's a whole bunch of history about him making up or claiming all kinds of things that everybody else is going, I don't know what he's talking about. So he really ramped up this game of I'm using this as a metaphor, of course, but he really turned up the juice on this thing because his ego was so woven into this construct. So when Kay said truth is a pathless land and pulled the rug out from that whole deal, it pulled the rug out from everything that George is and stood for and believed in and was communicating, etc., etc. I'm not challenging the truth or falseness about any of this stuff. I'm just saying that this is a game that the ego plays. In the enlightened state, there is no ego, so there is no game. The game doesn't exist in the enlightened state, which is what Kay was saying. The game only can be played in the unenlightened state. All games, Republican, Democrat, Buddhist, Christian, whatever you want to call it, whatever you identify with is a game that the ego is playing, because that whole construct is permeates the whole structure. So it's just what the whole thing is a game that the ego plays, a la Bohm, right? Play. It's theater. The ego was created and then identifies with this, and it forgot that it's a game and it's a role that it's playing, etc., etc. All that is blind. And then its whole life depends on sustaining the game, playing the game. Now, the coming world teacher game is the ultimate game. It trumps the Pope. This game, if you look at it from a game standpoint, this was the big game that they laid out. How could you get any closer to God than this? And you're chosen to play. Wow, what a game. So interesting. So from my standpoint, the interesting thing about all of this is the role that original sin plays in the very structure of your reality construct, which is different than the enlightened construct. That's number one. Negation is really the only way that you can free yourself from that. Also, a certain discipline and rigor to be constantly aware, as Kay said, of what's going on. And as Bohm said, we lose track of what's going on. We don't. The images keep popping in so fast, and they're so believable that we can't possibly keep track of it. David proposed that we are evolving what is called proprioception, which is a sense of knowing where the body is in three-dimensional space. He said what's evolving is proprioception of thought, which is, but thought is so fast that he said it really requires a great attention. But we have dissipated all of that attention chasing the illusions, chasing the tales and the fantasies that this machine is producing. We don't have any energy left because we're so angry at this and so mad, blah, 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 blah. So we are wasting all of our energy and attention chasing the phantoms that we are producing, and we don't have that energy left over to actually see what's going on. In the conversations with Rinpoche, there were a sequence of what he called meditations. The first meditation group, if you want to call it that, is paying attention. You can't do anything unless you can pay attention. And if all your energy has now been wasted chasing these phantoms, which we habitually do, and by the way, computers and social media and all the rest of the things that are going on are just bing, bang, boom, just driving us crazy. We are less attentive, we are less capable of attention now than ever before when we need it the most. He said, The second level of meditation is to negate all the phantoms, all the false images that we have created about self and others, all the negativity and the thoughts and the stuff. We have to go through and with a rigorous discipline negate all of the things that we have wasted our energy and attention on. Obviously, you can't do two unless you've done one. In their tradition, this was a kicker, in their tradition, if you could sit quietly for 4 hours and not have your mind waver or have a thought about lunch or the beautiful girl or whatever it is that would normally distract you, if you could do 4 hours, you were on first base. I thought that was pretty good. So now imagine being able to gather this tremendous energy and attention and not wasting it on all of this junk, what you could do. But you can only do when you have that clarity. And then there's a whole series of so-called meditations that allow you to actually be creative at that causal level, which is what the whole game is really about. Sir?
I think that when you're at that level of clarity, lots of doing is not getting done because you see through the doing, you see through the things that you want to do and the motivations behind all of that, like entertainment and so the doing.
I think Cade talked about doing in the sense of direct perception. The perception is the action. I'm not implying that there's a doer, or that there's. But in the Tibetan practices, there is intention. They use those as exercises, and that's what I'm really referring to. So.
Very practical.
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah. So to fine tune these capacities.
The Buddhists accept stages of initiation?
I'm sorry?
That means the Buddhists accept the stages of initiation like Leadbeater did?
Well, all of that is on this side of the door, right? So yeah, on this side of the door, the Buddhists do accept preparation. There's all kinds of things that one can do. Kay loosely did. He said, eat right. Take good care of the body. Groom it. Don't be tired. Don't drink and don't be hungover. Treat this. You want optimum clarity. So, he didn't break it down and say do this and you'll get that. Kay did not do that. The Buddhists, for centuries have all kinds of layered techniques and practices and things to reveal to you this crazy game that you're stuck in. Your lack of attention. You can't pay attention. Well, you can't be a force for cohesion and intelligence if you can't pay attention. So anyway, yes, they accept methods and practices in order to, you could call it sowing the soil that you're going to plant your seeds in. So yes, taking good care of yourself is that. My point is that, yes, sir.
The process of negation that you're talking about, does that ultimately extend even to the older brains, the sensory apparatus, for example? Isn't that also interpreted by our peculiar way of seeing the world?
I'm the last person to be able to go back to what the Buddhist traditions are really talking about. They are so elaborate. And I use the metaphor the rigor, the argumentation that they have brought to this negation process. They have 50 words for the word, Eskimos can say snow in 50 different ways. Well, the Buddhists in their traditions have these elaborate, segments and rituals and things that they've done over centuries to really look at snow. So I'm not a student. I'm way out. As I told Rinpoche, I said, I'm from Los Angeles. I don't know anything about Buddhism. So I can't even begin, but I do know that their systems and their metaphors and how they have very detailed and extreme
Say, question even that.
was somewhat basic image making that we've been talking about, how it supersedes everything powerful. That's why he was saying, often say, look at the eagle, or look at the plant, or look at the flower, observe what is, without the other overlay. And so that as a practice, if you will. There are lots of parallels actually, but Kay was the insight. The main is when Rinpoche said, I'll say it again. He said, there's only two states, enlightened and unenlightened. Anybody that's enlightened, same thing. Right? Yeah. There's a thing. How they describe the unit was going to be personal. Is going to be different. It's sacred. Yes.
Earlier that talked about the K in his ability, and again, I'm just seeing what I can see. If you're my wife, you're my husband, you're my child, or you're my car, I have a TV, whatever it is, your relationship to it, and paying attention to the relationship. So in human relationships, or anything, do I behave in such a way that either brings us closer together or farther apart? And in relationship to things, do I behave in such a way where I am that thing and then get caught up in all the illusion of it? But when we're kind of, talking about the sacred ground of that seeing, Kay's ability to say, can you see the bird? Can you see the flower? Often that word "can you" is something that is pathless, because it's like whoever you are, whatever you are, the journey's yours. You have to own. That's why there's no path. And I think, I don't know, there's a feel we're going on sacred ground here, because how Kay sees it, or Buddha, or Muhammad, or Krishna, or whoever, I don't think we can even go there or comment on if they see it the same way, or how they see it. Like,
there is no seer. There's no seer. There's no center that sees. There's no journey. There's no conclusion or destination or all of that's.
But saying that is also a point of reference of seeing.
Well, again, you've got these two realities, and they don't mix, right? Yeah. They have they're completely different realities, and they don't mix, and most of us don't know diddly about that one. Krishna?
Doesn't each one of those negations also need an insight? Because it can't be thought through.
I think that's the purpose of most of the whole negation process. When talking about this with Rinpoche, he said, the enlightened ones looked back and they all gave up. They said, there's no way that I can fix this mess.
No, but insight is not a way.
Yes. No. I'm telling a story that and it's quite famous. You know the story. Siddhartha sat under the tree. He finally had his realization, and then he kept his mouth shut. He didn't say a word. He realized that there was no way that he could fix the mess, if you wanted to use that. So he shut up. And then the celestial ones came down and said, look, dude, you have to do something. You can't do that. And he said, there's nothing I can do. And they said, yes, you can. He says, you can use a couple of things. You can use negation and you can use metaphor. And those two things, negation and metaphor, are the primary tools throughout the whole Buddhist tradition, and that's exactly what Kay used. He used negation and metaphor to help us, catch a glimpse, have an insight into original sin. So I'll leave you because I think our time is probably grinding down. We okay? I'm sorry? We have half an hour? Oh, great. So what do you want to talk about?
Ego is multiple egos, it is not linear. So this ego is taking that position, multiple. This is self. I'm saying the original sin, the way this is looking nowadays, is when when this awake, just
Bhanu can't hear you.
this conscious, when I'm awake, and then the awaken too. So, in the original scene, the way I see when I don't know, I'm not yet there. The way I see original scene is that when I'm awake, then I'm wakened too. That's the otherwising, the other, the culture. And awakened too is the consciousness. So the main original scene is there from awake, where, whatever is there, I'm not going to say anything, but when I'm awakened to the forms or whatever is light or anything, that's where the divisive nature or distancing itself from that light, from that darkness to the light. So I am awakened to, when I'm awakened to the whole phenomena, whatever it is, it's already a belated phenomena. It's already had been worked out. Either you call it hidden, or call it implicit, or neocortex, or all this cover is hidden, and what is little available is very little in this vast immensity. Okay, that's it. So here are this, trying to look at the tree from the window. Then the practice of Dzogchen teaching, undifferentiated way of looking. So, right? So now you practice undifferentiated. First you are saying, I'm here, I'm conscious of. But then I am practicing, then I started looking, there's no tree, no light, nothing whatsoever. Okay. So that's another state. But going further is everything, I suffer consciousness, because when I am conscious, I'm already suffering a falsity. Because it's already awakened to, otherwising, myself and you is already, that simultaneous occurrence has already become different. See, all that difference, distinction. So my thing is this about the greatest error in consciousness is about this division between light, enlightenment, and unenlightenment. They are not, I would prefer the word uncreated. So there's no one, nothing is created. And the consciousness is created. But point I want to make, what we are experiencing is already occurred. That's why occurred in behind the scene. That's why we cannot clean the mess.
So I have a wonderful colleague. His name is Keith Buzzell. Keith is an osteopath. He's also one of the senior Gurdjieff teachers around, really bright guy. And he wrote a book on television a number of years ago. And I was just kind of going through some of his notes, and it just has to do with what you're talking about. It takes time, actually, for sensations to come in through your senses and travel up through your nervous system and go through the emotional centers and actually pop into what we call conscious awareness. It takes time. And what he was saying is that both brain systems, the sensory brain and the limbic emotional brain, have reacted to that before you're aware that the event has taken place. So this is what you're talking about, is that I'm sorry?
Put attention also, play with attention at that point. How to be attentive, which is already, his life has already passed.
Yeah, I think that I was musing on the way about a related issue, maybe not quite the same, but it occurred to me that, and I would like your feedback about this because I'm still chewing on it. If you imagine this enormous capacity to imagine, which we just talked about, which causes all the messes because it's so busy doing what it's doing, if that was quiet, which is something that Kay suggested, if that mechanism was quiet, what other capacities are implicit in that capacity that we never see because we're so busy with chasing our tail? So we have both the neocortex, and then we have the prefrontals, which is even a later evolutionary addition, which has its own imagery and its own way of responding to things. And so once that neocortex shuts up, doing what it habitually does, it doesn't mean that it's dormant. What it means is that other implicit capacities that are normally not accessed or cultivated or realized are seen, are displayed, are made of, you're able to see aspects that's always been there, but the noise has been so loud that you would never hear what it was whispering to you.
Yeah, just the example, if your body is very toxic and you just putting good food on top of the toxicity, you're not going to have the same effect as if you go on a detoxification process first, so that you ground your body in its intelligent design by getting rid of the toxins, all that's accumulated, all the accumulation. And it seems like we've accumulated these ways of thinking or mechanisms that we've just been, they've just taken us over. We've given ourselves, however it works. But it sounds like you have to gain a middle ground or a clear ground from which to access the new, because we're not trained in it, we're not versed in it. And then that begins to grow, over time. There's when people go to a workshop and they have all these experiences that are powerful and they makes them want to go a certain way and do certain disciplines, but then they go home. It's the phenomenon, and then they go back into their regular lives and they kind of lose the distance that they experienced in the concentrated week or workshop. And what I started to understand, and I heard somebody say this as well after I'd already had my own experience with it, it's like the measure of, like at first, you've got what you've been versed in, the ground you've already been living in, and that's like, 80, 100% or what have you. So you get this influx of something new, and that, initially you're open to it because you're in it, and then you go back and the habit of everything you've been takes you back into it, like you're going uphill. You're going uphill until to over 50%, 51%, where the new has penetrated so much that it's become a part of you. And then, and it's almost like so much is to be explored
insights. He suggests being on the other side, that's the oracle, and then you have events, and in the oracle communicate, so on. And he said, but he said with the that window, yeah, and it's open.
Process of celebrating. One is one's attention on celebrators, right? Then there's a resonant energy, but it does. Celebration just get.
Can I tell you a metaphor? This is a metaphor. The mind or the images and that mess that we were talking about is like a child. The mind is like a child. Because if you have a child that's all day put your pants, he wants attention. And until bullying, it's getting into trouble, into messes. Like a child, that's a metaphor. You need to observe, I think Kate observe it.
Though we know something is, we are caught in illusion. Centuries ago, long ago, we believed that Earth revolving around Earth. Then some guy came, revolving around that. That's true. One guy came, another guy came, told, okay, you know what? The sun is also moving. It's saying, let's go and see. That could change. That's what is truth is Pathless land. So future generations may see truth than the current generation. That's just an illusion.
Sure. So I have copies of the essay. They weren't able quite to print them all out. So Eric said that he would have additional copies when?
I can do by the end of lunch and just
Okay.
bring them to the information booth.
Great. Great. Thank you very much. Oh, Madam Noah.
Just wanted to comment that in Christian Science, they completely, Mary Baker Eddy completely overturned, you might say, this idea of original sin. It's original enlightenment, actually. Have you explored that?
I haven't.
And she did look into Buddhism and so forth in the training. But people in Christian Science have a very interesting approach, and they don't play the music too much.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that my interpretation of original sin is the right interpretation. I just am using it as food for thought for us to talk about, you know? It's part of the play.
And also, this idea of the pathless land, you were talking earlier about no time, and maybe we'd add no space.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it pathless. I mean, there's no time.
Yeah, these are all, again, I'm trying to say that these are all aspects of a particular slice of reality that brain system does. The rest of the brain systems don't operate with that expansive potential. So we get lost in what the neocortex produces, whereas we just react to what the others are.
Observe it, it makes it less, it doesn't
Yes.
control it.
You know the clarity of looking at something here is now in the moment. It doesn't allow the imagination, which is so essential for us in the world today. It disallows the unreal to come into picture.
Right.
If you have the capacity to stay with what you see in the moment, you are staying with the truth, and your perception of look is there. And I thought you had that very clearly, but you left me mixed up because you're talking all about this original sin and blah, 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 I don't know what. So go back to the original thing of just seeing in the moment and stay with the clarity of it, because that is the truth. That is where beauty is, and I think you have it.
Sometimes.
Did you see it?
What does it come down to? Mutation has to take place, right? In the brain cells. And through what? Negation, perception, insight, excessive. It has to.
Well, again, I would.
That mutation has to take place. Mutation.
The quality of, know thyself, right? I mean, just know what you're dealing with, and we don't.
When the observer is the observer.
Well, perhaps, yeah.
See, we were talking about tradition. I mean, truth is the best, joy, passion. Okay?
Right.
Then you went to the Tibetan this. Tibetan.
Yeah.
That's raised by